why don't we start with a question to each of the panelists for them to address briefly in terms of costs or funding, or what was done that maybe was a creative way to deal with the cost of implementation if actual funds were not available. So do you want to start, Emma, and then we'll work our way down the chairs?
No, it's okay. You just repeat.
Did you want me to repeat the question? So it's always a challenge to find money or resources to do implementation of guidelines. So in your case, in each of your cases, can you comment on those challenges, limitations in funding or resources, or what was done to overcome that in order to actually implement your guideline?
Okay. All of us that have been involved in OASIS are all frontline clinicians. So we all hold our own clinic list. We're all meant to be out on the clinical floor delivering, our care. So we've had protected CPD time. So we have 3 hours a week that's protected. And we use that at the moment while we've been doing this. That has been used from like the very first minute all the way through the 3 hours. And having a bit of goodwill, we have had to go away and we've had to do a little bit in our own time. We have had to put things together like presentations and then coming out. So yeah, it's been nice. It's been very rewarding, but it would have been nice sometimes to have like a dedicated time set aside from the clinical floor to be able to do this.
Okay, thanks, Emma. We'll move on to you, Susan.
We were lucky to obtain funding from various sources to fund some of the aspects of the trial. So the Stroke Foundation, the National Stroke Foundation Australia, gave us some money, and the 2 health departments from New South Wales and South Australia, so state-based departments, gave us a bit of money. And of course, we stretched that a lot by turning it into a PhD project, which is one of our favourite ways of getting research done relatively cheaply and with quality. So we were lucky in that sense. I think in the initial setup, we had a bit of funding from Bayer to do the literature search. Like anything, this required a lot of people to donate their time. So I think in my slides I talked about how many people were involved in the formation of this tool. And you can't underestimate professionals and consumers donating their time for nothing, or maybe they're doing it in their work time, but therefore it's their employers who are donating their time. So I think that really needs to be acknowledged, especially with something like this that sort of really grabs people's motivation to make an improvement.
Right. And you, Linda?
I mean, I think we're actually in quite a privileged position with regard to funding. As always, there was funding secured initially for the guidance development programme, but we continue to fight for additional funding to incorporate implementation activities within this. It did take around 5 years until we actually secured that, but now we have core funding, recurrent core funding, that allows us to carry out implementation activities. So our trials within implementation, we actually don't need any external funding for this. If we try to be a bit more ambitious, we would do, and in these cases we tend to go to the funding bodies for this, but we do actually have core implementation funding within guidance development.
Great.
It's an important point, isn't it? Because even if after you've implemented your guideline it takes less resources, often just making the change happen is quite hard, and it does need extra effort. So I'm going to ask the top question on the app here, which is quite an important one for NICE, I guess, as a guideline developer that sometimes has quite long guidelines. So the question is, should guideline authors choose very carefully the recommendations that really need to be in the guideline? Because if even obvious ones aren't followed, then will the rest of them get a look in? So should they be shorter? Who wants to start? Start with you, Linda.
My short answer would be yes. Dentists always tell us that what they want is one side of A4. Preferably, it could be laminated. And I do appreciate this is not always possible, but I do think you have to prioritise the key recommendations. I think there is a use for almost like summaries without all the additional information that is often included within guidance documents. And very often busy practitioners, I think if they have a really dense document, I'm not convinced that they will actually even read it at all, never mind implement it.
Yeah, I think prioritising is a difficult process because, you know, as we've seen, it's very context dependent on where the issues are and what the priority might be. I think particularly implementing in health service, in the health services, where there's a pathway of care. You know, what we found was it was a barrier in some places, isn't a barrier in the others. So how would you set a priority for there? So this need to contextualise and adapt guidelines in different contexts. I wouldn't envy a guideline developer trying to predict what the priorities are based on the incredible heterogeneity. So it would be lovely, but I wouldn't expect it actually.
That is the challenge, the prioritisation. Emma, anything to
add?
I
think definitely with the prioritisation. I mean, you get your one set of guidelines, and the one we've been looking at, we've been working off the shortened one because you'd like to think that the key implementation, the key messages are there. So that's the one we've worked off because, again, we just haven't got all that time and resource that we need. So, like we said before, an A4 site would be very nice, but we know it's not that easy.
Okay, good. Next
All
one.
right. Then I'll try and articulate the next popular question. In your projects, did you see improvement that lived up to or matched the benefits associated with trials or the evidence upon which the guideline was based? Or if you haven't fully evaluated the impact of your intervention, are you expecting to see that?
We have collected, let's say, 3 years of data. We have found that what we have found is that by patients undertaking regular exercise and who have done 6 sessions or more have actually improved by 96% based against those that did 5 or less. So we've got, really nice meaty piece of sort of evidence there to say actually it's worth doing. We found that we've become quite more cost effective by using it. So we're having physio assistants to run these sessions, so we're not having physios run it, so we've become more cost effective. So, but yeah, we've definitely found some of the improvements, and that's where our evaluations come out.
Well, that's great. We know we don't always see consistent improvement in all of our implementation efforts, so that's very encouraging.
I guess ours is a little bit different in that the guideline recommendation that everybody receives an assessment for rehab isn't based on evidence as such. It's based on the fact that there is evidence that rehab is effective, but there's no evidence that we should assess for rehab. But it's kind of intuitive. I think it's a little bit in the same kind of ballpark as we know we need to use parachutes if we jump out of planes. Like we should do it. So we set our gold standard really as 100% based on a consensus of opinion based on the expert working group that we had. And obviously we didn't achieve 100%. And I think, the audience asked the very pertinent question is, well, does this actually improve patient outcomes? And that's certainly something that we need to look at as the sort of ultimate impact.
Okay. Currently we don't know. And this is partly why we're carrying out this randomised trial later this year. I think the key challenge there will be gathering data on the most appropriate outcomes, and in particular patient data information from patients, and evidence of harm, because there are occasions where antibiotics are required for dental infections. And although we know that previous work and our work has contributed to this because there's a lot of activity within Scotland within this area, we know it's reduced the quantity of antibiotics prescribed, but what we don't know is whether or not some patients who actually should have got antibiotics haven't had them. So I think that is a key thing that we have to look at within our trial.
There are some implementation projects, aren't there, that manage to do the data collection and feed it back sort of not quite in real time, but that can be quite a good motivator, can't it, if you can see the benefits as you're going through it.
So audit feedback is a really good tool because it's actually evaluating what you want to happen and feeding,
Okay, next on the list, the question is about the continuous noise of improvement initiatives. So there's all sorts of things happening all the time. How did you manage to make your practice change stand out from everything else that's going on? Perhaps there wasn't much, but on the assumption there was.
Would you mean that?
Yeah, would you like to start, Sue?
Yeah, sure. This is a problem. You know, there is a lot of noise, and in any of the public health systems, I would assume it's the same here as in Australia. There's a lot of imperatives around quality improvement and continuous quality improvement that is sort of, you know, in a way assumed to be done in people's spare time, in clinicians' spare time. So to raise this above that white noise is difficult. And I think it speaks to why the site champion is a really key person, because they're the ones who can raise this as a priority. So in a way it kind of harks back to how can the guideline developers stress priorities. That actually, if that priority forming can come from the clinicians, I think that's a really important thing, so that things do bubble up above the sort of general practice. Yeah.
Need some sort of weight behind it. Any thoughts? You don't have to answer all these questions if you
No,
you don't.
I mean, there is a lot of noise, there is a lot of pressure on clinicians to actually improve in many different areas. Within my own setting, very much the guidance, the national guidance that is delivered, it reflects the key priorities, both of the profession and of policy and makers, and our action plans for oral health improvement. So yeah, it's targeting what is important to the profession and to patient, and also it reflects what our national priorities for going forward. But it's difficult, and I'm quite sure we don't always succeed.
No.
Yeah, it's difficult. Sometimes the drivers are financial. That will bubble something up to being a priority. We've been shamelessly working with consumers to give them a voice and to help clinicians sort out what would be a priority from a consumer perspective, and that's arguably working better than a financial driver, because it speaks to the clinician really has to then evaluate their own values and beliefs in the face of the narrative coming from the consumer saying, actually, this is what we need.
The other thing I would say is just having somebody or groups of people there pushing it along, you know, keep sticking your head out and saying, actually, we're here, we're good. It's one of the things that got us noticed at Keele University when they put us as a regional example and then put us next to a national example of what we do. And we'll just keep out there, we keep pushing.
Right. Okay, I quite like this question, so I'm glad I get to pose it to each of you. What are you most proud of in relation to your implementation work?
Yeah.
Sure, go ahead.
I think my biggest achievement is sitting here talking to a vast array of people. You know, I'm really proud to think I come from a small community hospital, that I've done something that's got recognised, was part of the shared learning award, and it's just about keep pushing forward and being on this sort of national stage and being able to showcase a really small thing that we've done.
That had great impact.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Sorry.
Oh, okay. I got a text from one of my clinician colleagues who was part of this trial, and he'd got a letter from a patient thanking him for continuing to champion rehabilitation, and my neurology colleague said, I think we're coming out of the dark ages of rehabilitation nihilism, and that was really nice, because there was a discipline that wasn't particularly engaged in rehabilitation, and his point is that he thinks we've actually made a difference. We're actually starting to change some of the issues that I talked about, where there's this sort of belief that rehabilitation is a bit of black magic and a bit of icing on the cake. So that was terrific.
How about you, Linda?
Yeah, I would agree. Being here today, I feel it's quite an achievement. I think also that we have managed to integrate a guidance development and implementation programme, I think, is also quite an achievement. And now we will have practitioners who will approach us for support in implementing the guidance. And I mean, the first time that happened, I was truly amazed about this. But there's a long way still to go, I have to say.
Thank you.
We'll wind up in a few minutes so that there's time for the voting and the rest of the session. But there's a question here. A specific question about having Bayer, a drug company, funding your research review. Could this be a conflict of interest? It's quite a specific question.
Oh, that's me. Yeah.
If we could sort of turn that into a more general question around implementation and whether you considered any potential conflicts as you were doing that.
Yeah, the Bayer is something that I alluded to very early on in the formation of the assessment for rehab tool. We did receive $5,000 from Bayer to fund that. And we took that and it wasn't a conflict because Bayer, as you know, is a pharmaceutical company and it has no interest in rehab. Rehab is behavioural. There is no medication that supports rehabilitation. So there was no direct benefit to Bayer. It was a philanthropic, obviously it's a nice philanthropic thing to do and they got hopefully some nice press out of it, but there was no actual direct benefit to their company, bottom line, from having improved access to rehabilitation. So I think that's the way we evaluate. And as sort of rehabilitationists, we're delighted because we're not in the pharmacy business to get any of that kind of money. Yeah.
Does anybody else have any comments on conflicts of interest? Was it an issue?
For this study, it wasn't an issue at all. We have previously, not within implementation, within previous research, we have received partial funding from a manufacturer of toothbrushes. We were actually looking at how effective their electric toothbrushes were. And I actually found, certainly with this funder, that they made no effort at all to either influence what was done or actually the reporting of the findings, whether or not they were positive or negative. So I know there are concerns about commercial funding, and I'm sure in some cases these are quite relevant, but I do think it's an area that should be explored and the potential shouldn't be overlooked.
We've not really had that much of it. We've not come across it, but...
Okay. One last question.
Yeah, one last question, and if I may, I'll pose a question to each of the panelists. We have made such great strides in the last decade in terms of understanding the process of optimizing guideline implementation, but something that remains a bit of a struggle or an uncertainty is how to choose the implementation intervention or strategy that best matches either the guideline recommendations or the pre-identified barriers or challenges to uptake or use of the guidelines. So I wonder if each of you could offer a brief insight or observation or advice on what worked for you or maybe didn't work that we could learn from in terms of matching or choosing the right implementation intervention or strategy.
I think for us, in being in physio and looking at the guideline that we did, and exercise being the core treatment, it was very nice actually because it tallied up really quite well. It was the obvious choice to look at that part first. It's once you start getting down those layers that actually you think, oh, we're meant to do this and this is meant to be added and we're meant to be doing this. But I think picking the one and trying to get that one right. And I think if you can get that one right, and even if you're sort of collecting your data and just see what you've already got in place, adding that one thing, does it change, does it help with your outcomes, then that would be...
So starting somewhere helps, and we don't always need to use a multifaceted approach. No. Sometimes we need to take it one step just at a time.
Piece, yeah.
Susan?
And that was our research question in the most recent study was, do we need a multifaceted versus a very simple? And of course, the simple one worked as well in that sense, in that very baseline measure. Other things did improve with the multifaceted. I didn't present all of our outcome data. But our general view was that it does need to be bespoke, so a bit of an action research kind of approach where you are working with sites to get them involved in what will they need in order, is it just education? Is it audit and feedback? Do we need more behaviour change approaches? And we're now starting to test the temperature in sites when we go in and actually do a behaviour change readiness questionnaire, just to take the temperature of the organisation and see how ready the clinicians are and what they're viewing about the issues, and then starting to put in the bespoke kind of strategies that they need, which could go from very minimal through to multifaceted, but based on what we're seeing in the site.
So the all-important stakeholder engagement, so that we really understand the context, and then we can tailor the implementation strategy to that context.
Absolutely.
Linda?
What we find with our guidance is that there's very often many recommendations, not just one recommendation to implement. So initially we work with stakeholders to try and prioritise these recommendations for implementation, which ones are most important for improving patient outcomes. And then we'll look at the feasibility of an intervention and to actually address this. So we do a prioritising initially. We also, with the Triads collaboration, we use theories of behaviour change very much to guide what the interventions will be and how these will be delivered. And that tends to be the approach that we take.
Yeah, and that does address one of the questions that we didn't get to, which is how do you use theory or models, such as the behaviour change model, to help us further tailor our implementation interventions. All right, maybe we could give the panelists one more hand before we move on to the next.
Those were great, regardless of which one of you wins. They've all been excellent examples of implementation. When you organise a conference, you always worry about something going wrong, don't you? And now coming to vote for the winner is not the time for the technology to go wrong. I really don't want us to have to vote for the winner with a show of hands. That wouldn't be good at all, would it? So in a moment, you'll be able to see the question, but you won't see the results because we're going to announce that separately. And I do want to take the opportunity to give our thanks to the European Society of Cardiology because they have sponsored this award, recognising the importance of implementation at the end of the guidance production process, and the prize for the winner will be €1,000. So really, really, really good prize, and thanks again to the European Society of Cardiology. So are we ready to do the voting, is the question. Here we are. I can see it on my phone. Which of these case studies is the most impressive example of overcoming an implementation challenge? So if you want to vote now, and as I say, you won't see on this occasion the winner. And if you cast your vote, and while you're doing that, because in a moment we'll absolutely close it down, but while you're doing that, just to say after this, we'll also be announcing the winner of the poster prize. And then there will be the closing ceremony. So please do stay for that. Don't run away after this. It's always good to hear all the thanks and the plans for the next conference in Adelaide before we all leave. So I'm hoping somebody's going to give me some sort of sign to say it's all done. Is it all ready to go? You're waving a nicely rolled up certificate in your hand. So I'd be pleased to invite to the stage Veronica Deane from the European Society of Cardiology, Head of Practice Guidelines Department, and you're going to announce the winner and present the award. I don't think you've got a mic, have you? So you need to come and stand here. Over to you.
Well, first of all, I want to thank all three of you. It was extremely exciting projects. I'm going to be taking a lot of this back to our guidelines developers because I think now that we have these implementation examples, we need to feed them back up the line to the guideline development teams, definitely. So thank you very much for this. So on behalf of the ESC...
So we need a drum roll.
So Emma, you are the winner.
Way. Well, thanks again to everyone. That was a really great session. Well done, Emma, and thank you, Veronica. So I think we're now moving on to the announcement of the poster prize. Am I missing something?
Here we go. I'll let you do the announcement.
Am I doing the announcement?
Another
Okay,
drum
yeah,
roll.
Yeah. Okay. Right. I'm doing the announcement of the best poster presentation, and the winner is Safia Mokrain for Guideline Development Training Courses, A Belgian Experience. So I think we're going to see it on the screen, and hopefully
Is Safia
is
here? Safia.
Safia. Is she here?
Oh.
Is that Safia? Well done. Excellent. Are we going to have a photo taken? We need a. Would you like to make a speech?
Thank you for voted for my poster. It's a collective poster of the Belgium team of development of guidelines. So thank you for the team also. And
Well done. Well done.